Society loves a train wreck, but they love a spinster even more. Arthur Pendleton, the Earl of Cleveland, was London's favourite punchline. A stuttering, limping recluse who preferred the cold brass of his pocket watches to the waltzes of Mayfair. Genevieve Hastings was the diamond who stayed on the shelf too long. Bitter, sharp-tongued, and secretly penniless, she was practically radioactive. They were the bottom of the aristocratic barrel, until the night she walked past a dozen eligible dukes and asked the village idiot to dance. It was the sort of heat that melted the wax from the chandeliers and the polite veneers off the aristocracy. Lady Ashbourne's annual ball was a claustrophobic nightmare of silk, sweat, and desperation. Genevieve Hastings stood near the wilted potted palms, nursing a cup of lukewarm lemonade that tasted vaguely of tin. She was 26 years old. In the cruel mathematics of the ton, she was a relic, an antique, a stunningly beautiful piece of furniture that no one wanted to buy because the appraisal came up empty. 8 seasons, 8 years of standing against silk-papered walls, smiling until her jaw ached, pretending she didn't know her father had gambled away the family estate before putting a pistol in his mouth. Society didn't know the extent of the rot, but they smelled it. They smelled the lack of a dowry like blood in the water. "You look bored, Miss Hastings, or perhaps merely tragic." Genevieve didn't turn her head. She knew the drawl. Lord Harrington, he was handsome in the way a hunting dog was handsome, sleek, privileged, and bred entirely to tear smaller things apart. He was also a bachelor of immense wealth, which meant her aunt had been violently shoving Genevieve in his direction for a month. "I am conserving my energy, my lord," Genevieve said, her voice a flat, deadpan drawl. "Existing in the same room as so much inflated ego is terribly exhausting." Harrington chuckled. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. "Careful, Genevieve. A sharp tongue is only charming in a woman who can afford to be difficult. I hear your aunt has let the carriage go. Down to walking to the Modiste, are we?" Genevieve's grip on her glass tightened, her knuckles going white beneath her worn gloves. He knew. Of course he knew. Before she could form a reply sharp enough to draw blood, a loud clatter shattered the low hum of the ballroom. It came from the alcove across the floor. A man had collided with a footman carrying a tray of champagne. But it wasn't just glass that hit the parquet floor. It was a spray of tiny, glittering metal pieces. Brass cogs, silver springs, and a half-assembled copper chassis scattered like gold dust across the polished wood. The music faltered. The room turned. Standing in the centre of the wreckage was Arthur Pendleton, the Earl of Cleveland. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and entirely awkward in his own skin, as if someone had built a giant and forgot to give him the instruction manual on how to operate his limbs. His dark hair was hopelessly rumpled, his cravat tied with an alarming lack of symmetry. He stood frozen, staring down at the ruined mechanics at his feet. His right leg, heavily scarred beneath his trousers from the carriage accident that had orphaned him a decade ago, trembled visibly as he leaned all his weight onto his silver-handled cane. "Good God, it's the mad Earl!" Harrington sneered, his attention mercifully diverted from Genevieve. "Brought his toys to the ball. How entirely pathetic!" Laughter rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the polite, muffled laughter of a faux pas. It was cruel. It was the laughter of a pack finding the weakest animal. Arthur dropped to his knees. He didn't care about his evening wear. He began frantically sweeping his large, calloused hands over the floor, trying to gather the microscopic gears of whatever automaton he had been tinkering with in the shadows. He looked up, his face flushed a painful, mottled red. His jaw locked. The stutter was a physical barrier, choking the air from his lungs. The harder he tried to push the apology out, the tighter his throat clamped. He hit his fist against his thigh in frustration. "Spit it out, Cleveland!" a voice called from the back. "Or has the clockwork in your head finally wound down?" More laughter. Genevieve watched him. She saw the sweat beading on his forehead. She saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in his dark eyes. He was drowning. He was drowning in a sea of silk and taffeta, and not a single person in this room was going to throw him a line. She looked at Harrington, who was grinning with vicious delight. Then she looked back at Arthur. She didn't feel pity. Pity was useless. Pity didn't pay the butcher, and pity didn't pick up brass gears from a sticky dance floor. What she felt was a sudden, violent surge of kinship. They were the same, she realized. They were both punchlines. Society had just chosen to mock him for his broken body and tongue, and her for her empty pockets and refusal to beg. Genevieve set her lemonade on a passing tray. "Where are you going?" Harrington asked, his smirk faltering. "To do something useful," she said. "A concept you would find entirely foreign." Genevieve stepped away from the wall. The distance between the potted palms and the alcove was perhaps 30 feet, but in a Mayfair ballroom she might as well have been crossing a battlefield. Every step she took drew the eyes of the ton. The whispering started immediately, a hiss of gossip that swept through the crowd like a gust of wind through dry leaves. She ignored them. She kept her spine rigidly straight, her chin parallel to the floor, her expression a mask of bored indifference. She reached the alcove. Arthur was still on his knees, his fingers fumbling awkwardly with a tiny, star-shaped gear that refused to be picked up by his shaking hands. Genevieve knelt. The collective gasp from the dowagers nearby was audible. A woman of her standing, even a poor one, did not kneel on a dirty floor in a silk gown for anyone, let alone the town pariah. She reached out, her gloved fingers gently pinning the gear to the wood. She picked it up. It was cold and surprisingly heavy. Arthur flinched backward, his cane clattering to the floor. He looked at her, as if she held a live grenade. His dark eyes were wide, the panic in them raw and bleeding. Up close, she noticed he smelled of bergamot, machine oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. "They will rust if you leave them there, my lord," Genevieve said, her voice quiet. "Just for him. I can—" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. But please, do not trouble yourself." "It is no trouble," she lied effortlessly. She began gathering up the small springs, dropping them into the cupped palm of his hand. "Though I suggest you construct your next pocket watch in a room with fewer feet." He blinked. The sheer normalcy of her tone seemed to short-circuit his panic. He looked down at his hands, then at her face. It is not a watch." "Oh?" She picked up a larger brass casing. "What is it?" "A bird. A nightingale." He took a deep breath, fighting the lock in his jaw. "The gigas. They mimic the vocal cords. It sings." "Fascinating," she said, and meant it. She stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt with one hand, and offered him the other. Arthur stared at her hand. It was a lifeline. He hesitated, then grasped his cane, hauled himself upright with a wince, and took the small metal pieces she held out. He shoved them into his pocket. The silence in the room was now absolute. 100 pairs of eyes were boring into them. Genevieve could feel the weight of their judgment, heavy and suffocating. She knew what they were waiting for. They were waiting for her to pat him on the head and walk away. They were waiting for the punchline. Genevieve looked at the musicians on the dais. The violinist was staring at her, his bow suspended above the strings. She turned back to Arthur. "My lord," she said, her voice clear, projecting just enough to carry over the silent floor. "I believe this is a waltz. Would you care to dance?" Arthur turned the color of chalk. You are mocking me." "I never mock a man who can build a singing bird," she said flatly. I am asking you to dance because I wish to dance, and because if I have to listen to Lord Harrington talk about his stables for 1 more minute, I am going to stab him with a dessert fork." A tiny, breathless sound escaped Arthur. It took her a second to realize it was a laugh. "I have a limp," he whispered, his face burning. "I am not a graceful mere man, Miss Hastings. And I have been standing in uncomfortable shoes for 3 hours." She shot back. "We will accommodate each other." She didn't wait for him to agree. She stepped into his space, placed her hand firmly on his shoulder, and took his left hand in hers. She shot a glare at the orchestra leader that could have stripped paint off a wall. The man scrambled, tapping his baton, and a slightly frantic waltz began to play. Arthur moved like a rusted machine. His right leg was stiff, the mechanics of his stride compromised by old, badly healed bone. He stepped on the hem of her gown within the first 3 seconds. I apologize," he choked out, staring in horror at the scuff mark on her shoe. "Stop looking at my feet and look at the wall behind my head," Genevieve instructed, her grip on his hand tightening. "And tell me about the escapement wheel on that bird." What? "The escapement wheel," she repeated, dragging him slightly to the left to avoid a collision with a staring countess. "How does it regulate the speed of the song?" Arthur stared at her. He was sweating, his chest heaving under his waistcoat. But slowly, the necessity of answering a technical question overrode his social terror. It is a cylinder escapement," he murmured, his eyes focusing on the wall above her head as instructed. The balance wheel oscillates, and a pin drops into the teeth of the escape wheel. It releases the energy of the mainspring in fractions, so it doesn't spin out of control all at once. "Yes, exactly." He looked down at her face, surprised. The stutter had smoothed out, the syllables linking together as his brain engaged with the familiar territory of mechanics. Without it, the tension releases violently. The machine destroys itself. A fitting metaphor for society, wouldn't you say? Genevieve mused. Arthur missed a step. But this time, he didn't apologize. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the sharp intelligence behind the beautiful, bored face. He saw the cynical slant of her mouth and the exhaustion bruising the skin under her eyes. "Why did you do this?" he asked softly, his hand trembling slightly against her waist. "Because they were looking at you the way they look at me," Genevieve said. The music swelled, masking her words from the rest of the room. "And I have decided I am quite done being a spectator to my own humiliation." The waltz ended. The music died. Genevieve stepped back, dropping into a flawless, deep curtsy. Arthur, looking entirely bewildered, executed a stiff but passably formal bow. When they parted, Genevieve knew she had just incinerated her reputation. She had strapped herself to a sinking ship. But as she walked out of the ballroom, head held high, leaving Harrington staring open-mouthed in her wake, she realized something strange. For the first time in 8 years, she felt like she could breathe. The light of morning was merciless. It dragged across the threadbare carpet of the Hastings rented townhouse, illuminating every speck of dust and every frayed seam. Genevieve sat at the small writing desk in the parlor, a ledger open before her. The numbers were not just bad, they were fatal. To the left, the grocer, the butcher, the landlord, the modiste. To the right, absolute zero. "You are a fool! A reckless, stupid, suicidal fool!" Aunt Agatha was pacing the length of the parlor, her silk mourning wrapper swishing furiously. She was a woman who had survived 3 husbands and expected to survive her niece's poverty by virtue of sheer willpower. "I was not aware that dancing was a capital offense, Aunt," Genevieve murmured, dipping her quill into the inkwell and crossing out a line for a hat she had promised her younger sister Beatrice. It would have to wait. Forever, probably. "You snubbed Lord Harrington!" Agatha shrieked, throwing her hands in the air. "A man with 40,000 a year! And for what? To play Florence Nightingale to the mad Earl? Do you know what they are saying this morning? They are saying you are so desperate, so utterly bereft of options, that you threw yourself at a crippled stutterer because no sane man would have you!" Genevieve's hand froze. The ink blotted on the rough paper, spreading like a dark bruise. She thought of Beatrice, asleep upstairs. Sweet, naive, hopeful Beatrice, who was supposed to make her debut next spring. Beatrice, who didn't know their father had shot himself over a gambling debt, only that he had died of a sudden illness. If Genevieve didn't secure a match, Beatrice wouldn't even make it to a ballroom. She would be forced into a governess position. Or worse, Harrington was supposed to be the sacrificial altar. Genevieve had known this. She had steeled herself for it. But when the moment came, looking at Harrington's cruel, wet mouth, and then looking at Arthur Pendleton bleeding dignity on the floor, she hadn't been able to do it. "Harrington is a sadist, Aunt," Genevieve said quietly. "If I married him, he would lock you in a dower house in Yorkshire and let me slowly rot in his London townhouse. He would not pay our debts. He would hold them over our heads until we broke." Agatha stopped pacing. She looked at her niece, her anger deflating into a tired, panicked sag. "And what will the Earl of Clevedon do? Buy you a clock?" 3 streets away, the Earl of Clevedon was doing exactly that. Arthur's workshop was the only room in his massive, echoing townhouse that felt alive. The rest of the house was draped in Holland covers, a monument to a family that had died in a tangle of splintered wood and screaming horses a decade ago. But the workshop smelled of brass polish, machine oil, and strong tea. He sat at his workbench, a jeweller's loop screwed into his right eye. His leg throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that accompanied rain and extreme stress. Today it was both. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the ballroom. He felt the cold terror of the floor. And then he felt the firm, unyielding grip of a gloved hand on his shoulder. "Stop looking at my feet and look at the wall behind my head." He had spent his entire life being pitied, ignored, or laughed at. His stutter made people treat him like an infant. His limp made them treat him like an invalid. Genevieve Hastings had treated him like a piece of faulty machinery that simply needed a firm tap to start working again. He set down his tweezers and rubbed his face. He had ruined her. He wasn't stupid. He read the society papers. He knew she was aging out of the marriage mart. He knew what attaching herself to him in public would do to her fragile standing. He looked at the object sitting in the center of his desk. He had spent the last 8 hours building it. "Thomas," Arthur called out, his voice rough. His valet, a stoic older man who had been with the family since Arthur was a boy in short pants, stepped into the room. He took one look at the dark circles under his master's eyes and sighed. "You require a bath, my lord. Not more brass." "I require a carriage," Arthur said, standing up and immediately grabbing his cane as his bad leg threatened to buckle. "Have it brought round. I must make a call." Thomas raised a grey eyebrow. "A call, my lord? At this hour? To whom? Miss Hastings?" Thomas paused. He had heard the gossip from the footman who had returned from the Ashbourne ball. "My lord, are you certain? The ton is—" "I don't care about the ton," Arthur said, a rare flash of steel in his tone, free of hesitation. He picked up the small mahogany box from his desk. "I must apologize." An hour later, the Hastings parlour felt smaller than usual. Arthur sat on the edge of a faded velvet armchair, his cane resting between his knees. He felt enormous, clumsy, and entirely out of place. Aunt Agatha sat opposite him, looking as though someone had just tracked mud onto her favourite rug. She poured tea with aggressive, clinking motions. Genevieve sat beside her aunt, spine straight, her face an unreadable mask. In the daylight, without the silk and pearls, she looked tired, beautiful, but deeply, profoundly exhausted. "We do not usually receive callers so early, my lord," Agatha said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that failed to mask the acid underneath. "Especially not unexpected ones." "Aunt?" Genevieve warned softly. "I apologize for the intrusion," Arthur forced out, his knuckles white on his cane. He hated this. He hated the parlor, he hated the tea, he hated the pitying, sneering look on the older woman's face. "I am sure you do," Agatha sniffed. "Though apologies hardly mend reputations, do they? After your little display last night, my niece is the talk of the town, and not in a manner that secures proposals." Genevieve closed her eyes briefly. "That is enough, Aunt Agatha." "It is not enough," Agatha snapped, turning on her. "He has made a mockery of you. He used you as a crutch to save his own pride." Arthur's head snapped up. He didn't think. The anger that flared in his chest burned away the anxiety that usually locked his vocal cords. "I did not use her," Arthur said. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely steady. The sudden lack of stutter shocked the room into silence. "I dropped my tools like a fool, and your niece was the only person in that God-forsaken room with the backbone to do anything but laugh. If anyone's reputation is stained by our association, it is mine, for allowing someone of her grace to lower herself to the floor for me." Agatha's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Genevieve stared at him. The flat, cynical mask she wore had cracked. Her eyes were wide, a strange, flickering light in them. Arthur realized what he had done. He had spoken a full, unbroken paragraph. The adrenaline faded, and the familiar, suffocating panic began to rush back in. He stood up hastily, his knee protesting with a sharp spike of pain. I must go," he stammered, pulling the small mahogany box from his coat pocket. He placed it awkwardly on the tea table, nearly upsetting a cup. "I brought this. For you. A tea token." He didn't wait for a reply. He limped out of the parlor as fast as his bad leg would carry him, the sound of his cane hitting the floorboards echoing like gunshots in the quiet house. Genevieve watched him leave. The front door slammed. Silence descended on the parlor. Aunt Agatha looked at the box on the table as if it were a bomb. "What on earth?" Genevieve reached forward and pulled the box toward her. It was heavy, beautifully polished wood. She unlatched the tiny brass clasp and opened the lid. Inside sat a mechanical lotus flower, crafted from wafer-thin sheets of copper and silver. Beneath it was a small winding key. Slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, Genevieve took the key and inserted it into the base. She turned it 3 times. With a soft metallic whir, the lotus began to move. The copper petals unfurled, one by one, sliding back with smooth, frictionless precision. In the center of the bloomed flower sat a tiny, perfectly formed glass sphere. Beneath the flower was a folded piece of heavy parchment. Genevieve opened it. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and precise. The handwriting of an engineer, not a poet. "I observed your fascination with the gears. A small token for your patience with a clumsy man. You were the only thing in that room that made sense." Genevieve looked at the mechanical flower. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a love letter. It was a piece of his mind, offered to her in copper and glass. "Well?" Aunt Agatha demanded. "What does it say? Is it an apology?" Genevieve carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had felt in years, touched the corners of her mouth. "No, Aunt," Genevieve said softly, watching the lotus slowly fold its petals back up as the tension in the spring released. I think it's a proposal. Clevedon House sat on Grosvenor Square like a missing tooth. The surrounding mansions were brilliant with fresh paint and polished brass. But Arthur Pendleton's ancestral home was a monolith of grey stone and drawn curtains. It looked dead. Genevieve paid the hackney driver with the last 3 coins in her reticule. She stood on the pavement, ignoring the drizzle spotting her grey wool pelisse. Unescorted, uninvited, unhinged. That was what Aunt Agatha had screamed when Genevieve marched out the front door. She climbed the steps and lifted the heavy iron knocker. It took a long time for the door to open. When it did, Thomas, the stoic valet, stood in the aperture. He looked at her, looked at the empty street behind her, and blinked. "Miss Hastings." "I need to speak with the Earl," Genevieve said. Her voice was flat, betraying none of the acid churning in her stomach. Thomas hesitated. A proper servant would have turned her away. A young, unmarried woman calling on a bachelor was social suicide. But Thomas had seen the lotus flower. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "He is in the workshop, miss. He does not like to be disturbed." "I am entirely comfortable with being disliked." She followed Thomas through a cavernous, echoing hallway. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through dirty skylights. The house smelled of stale air, floor wax, and neglect. It was a tomb waiting for a body. Thomas stopped before a heavy oak door at the back of the house and knocked once before opening it. The workshop was a chaotic explosion of industry. Diagrams were pinned to every vertical surface. Lathes, gears, and coils of copper wire littered long oak tables. In the center of the madness stood Arthur. He wore no coat, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a smudge of grease across his cheek. He was filing down a brass pin, his concentration absolute. "My lord," Thomas said loudly. "Miss Hastings is here." Arthur's hand jerked. The file slipped, scoring a bright, jagged line across the brass. He spun around, dropping the tool. He looked at Genevieve as if she had just materialized from thin air. What?" he choked out. He looked down at his grease-stained shirt, then at her immaculate, if-worn day dress. Panic flared in his eyes. "You cannot be here! It is highly improper." "Propriety has not paid my grocer in 3 years, my lord," Genevieve said. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, shutting Thomas out. The click of the latch sounded like a gavel dropping. Arthur limped backward, leaning against a workbench. "Why are you here?" Genevieve walked over to the nearest table. She picked up a steel cog, turning it over in her gloved fingers. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she might lose her nerve. "You sent me a lotus flower," she said. A token, an apology." "It was a masterclass in mechanical engineering, Arthur. Men do not send things that take 40 hours to build as an apology for dropping a nightingale." She set the cog down and finally met his eyes. "You sent it because you saw a door open, and you wanted to know if I would walk through it." He went entirely still. The stutter, the panic, the clumsy franticness. It all vanished. Underneath the anxiety was a man who understood how things fit together. He was calculating. "And have you?" he asked quietly. No stutter. "I am standing in your workshop." Genevieve squared her shoulders. "I will be blunt. My father left us penniless. My aunt is holding off our creditors with sheer arrogance, and my younger sister, Beatrice, needs a dowry, or she will be forced to marry a man 3 times her age or become a governess. I have nothing to offer but a very old, very respectable name, and a face that the ton has decided is acceptable." Arthur watched her. "You are selling yourself." "I am securing my family." she corrected sharply. Do not dress it up in morality. We are both desperate. I need money. You need a buffer. If you marry me, the ton will stop laughing at you. They will be too busy dissecting my fall from grace. I will manage your house. I will manage your staff. I will sit at the other end of your table, and I will never, ever treat you like a broken toy. The silence stretched. The only sound was the ticking of a dozen clocks scattered around the room. Arthur looked at the woman before him. She was terrifying. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the cold, jagged pragmatism in her eyes that caught him. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a business partner. I do not like society, Arthur said softly. We will only attend what is necessary, Genevieve replied instantly. 4 events a season, enough to prove we are alive and to launch my sister. The rest of the time, you may stay in this room and build an entire mechanical aviary for all I care. Arthur looked down at his ruined leg. I am not a normal man, Genevieve. I require patience, and I do not know how to be a high husband. I am not looking for poetry, she said. Her voice softened, just a fraction. I am looking for a truce. Can't we offer each other that? Arthur looked back up. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, carefully hidden in the folds of her skirt. She was terrified, too. He reached out, bypassing the brass and steel on his bench, and picked up a clean rag. He wiped the grease from his hands with slow, deliberate motions. Thomas will send for my solicitor, Arthur said. We will draft the settlements this afternoon. Your sister will have £10,000. Genevieve exhaled. It was a shaky, hollow sound. She closed her eyes for a brief second, the crushing weight of 8 years of terror sliding off her shoulders. Thank you, my lord. Arthur, he corrected quietly. If we are to be a tea truce, you must call me Arthur. They married 3 weeks later in a small, damp church in Marylebone. There were no flowers. There were no crowds. Beatrice wept with relief and confusion in the front pew, while Aunt Agatha wore black silk and an expression of martyred endurance. Arthur wore a dark coat that fit him perfectly, his jaw tight, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane. He stuttered over his vows twice. Genevieve did not flinch, did not try to finish his sentences, and simply waited until he found the words. When he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his hand was warm. The honeymoon consisted of a carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square. Within 48 hours, Genevieve went to war. She did not demand new dresses or redecorate the drawing rooms. Instead, she demanded the estate ledgers. She found them in a mouldering heap in the library. For 3 days, she locked herself in the room with pots of black coffee and a sharp quill. What she found was a massacre. The estate manager in Somerset had been skimming profits for 5 years. The butcher in London was charging them triple for offcuts, assuming the mad, crippled Earl would never notice. On the 4th day, she fired the cook, the butcher, and sent a terrifying, legally binding letter to the estate manager via Arthur's solicitor. Arthur observed this all with a mixture of awe and mild terror. He was used to a house that operated on pity and neglect. His servants had treated him like a fragile invalid, ignoring his commands and stealing his wine. Genevieve treated the household like a faulty engine. She stripped it down to the studs, oiled the gears, and forced it to run. You are ruthless, Arthur observed one evening. He was standing in the doorway of the library. Genevieve was at the mahogany desk, ink on her fingers, a stray curl falling out of her severe bun. I am efficient, she corrected, not looking up from a butcher's bill. And I despise being cheated. Your previous cook was buying mutton and charging you for venison. It's insulting to both your purse and your palate. Arthur walked into the room. His limp was pronounced tonight. The damp autumn air was settling into his bones. He stopped at the edge of the desk. "I never noticed what I ate." Genevieve finally looked up. She took in his drawn face, the tight lines around his eyes. She set a quill down. "You are in pain. It is merely the damp. Sit down, Arthur." It wasn't a request. He hesitated, then lowered himself heavily into a leather wingback chair near the fire. He stretched his right leg out with a suppressed hiss of breath. Genevieve stood, walked over to a side table, and poured a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter. She brought it to him, pressing the glass into his large hand. "Thank you," he murmured, taking a sip. The liquor burned a pleasant path down his throat. She didn't return to the desk. Instead, she took the chair opposite him. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across her face, softening the harsh, cynical edges she usually wore like armor. "Why did you stop building?" she asked. Arthur froze. "What?" "I have been here a month. I have heard the lathes running exactly twice. When I came to negotiate our marriage, your workshop looked like a factory. Now it is silent." He stared at the amber liquid in his glass. I have been trying to stay out of your way. You are reordering the house. I did not wish to add to the chaos." Genevieve leaned forward. "Arthur, look at me." He raised his eyes. "I did not marry you to domesticate you," she said, her voice fiercely quiet. "I married you because you were the only man in London who looked at the wreckage of my life and handed me a blueprint instead of a pitying smile. Do not stop building because I am here. This is your house. If you want to run a copper wire through the dining room, do it." A slow, unexpected heat rose in Arthur's chest. He looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't just tolerating him, she was guarding him. She had built a fortress out of ledgers and fired servants, and she was standing at the gate. "I am working on a new escapement," he said, the words slipping out easier than they had in days, "for a maritime chronometer, to solve the problem of barometric pressure altering the springs." "Show me." Arthur blinked. "Now." "Why not?" He hauled himself up, a genuine, albeit small smile breaking across his face. He led her down the hallway to the workshop. He lit the gas lamps, bathing the room in warm, golden light. He pulled a massive sheet of parchment onto the central table. It was covered in intricate charcoal drawings, mathematical formulas, and cross-sections of gears. Genevieve stepped up beside him. "The issue," Arthur said, pointing a grease-stained finger at a complex cluster of springs, "is that metal expands and key contracts with temperature. On a ship, the temperature fluctuates wildly. The clock loses time. A lost minute means being miles off course." Genevieve leaned over the table. Her shoulder brushed his arm. She didn't pull away. Arthur's breath caught slightly. He smelled her perfume, something sharp and clean, like lavender and rain. He forced himself to focus on the charcoal lines. "So how do you stop the metal from expanding?" she asked, tracing a line on the paper. "You don't. You build a bimetallic strip. Two different metals, brass and steel, fused together. They expand at different rates, cancelling each other out." He looked down at her. She was staring at the diagram, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't patronizing him. She was trying to understand. "It's brilliant," she murmured. "It is only theoretical," he cautioned, though his chest swelled at the praise. "I have not machined the parts yet." "Then you should start tomorrow." Genevieve turned her head. Her face was only inches from his. The sudden proximity hit him like a physical blow. He could see the faint smattering of freckles across her nose that powder usually hid. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The ticking of the clocks seemed to grow louder, filling the heavy silence. Arthur realized, with a jolt of panic and something much deeper, that he wanted to kiss her. Genevieve held his gaze. She didn't retreat. She simply waited, her breath shallow. Arthur swallowed hard, the old fear clawing at his throat. He was clumsy. He would ruin it. He stepped back, bumping into the table. It is late, he stammered, his face burning. You should sleep. Genevieve's expression flickered, a brief flash of disappointment masked quickly by her usual calm neutrality. Of course. Good night, Arthur. She walked out, the click of the door echoing behind her. Arthur braced his hands on the workbench, dropping his head between his shoulders, and cursed himself for a coward. Lady Rutledge's autumn soiree was unavoidable. It was the unofficial opening of the minor season, and if Beatrice was to debut in the spring, the Earl and Countess of Clevedon had to prove they were not social lepers. Genevieve stood before her vanity mirror, fastening a simple sapphire pendant around her neck. It was a family heirloom she had reclaimed from the pawnshop that morning, using the first of Arthur's quarterly allowance. She wore dark blue silk, entirely devoid of the ruffled desperation she had worn a month ago. She looked wealthy. She looked untouchable. Arthur entered her dressing room. It was the first time he had crossed the threshold of her private chambers. He wore a severe black evening coat, a stark white cravat tied with geometric precision. He looked incredibly pale. "Are you ready?" she asked, turning to him. He stared at her. "You look formidable." "Good. Formidable is precisely what we require." She walked over to him, picking up his silver-handled cane from where he had leaned it against a chair, and handed it to him. "Your limp is worse when you try to hide it. Lean on the cane. Let them look." Arthur took the cane. "They will whisper, Genevieve." "Let them," she said, slipping her gloved hand through the crook of his arm. "Whispers cannot penetrate a bank vault, Arthur. We are untouchable." The carriage ride to Mayfair was silent. Arthur's leg throbbed with a vicious, rhythmic ache. He gripped the head of his cane until his fingers ached. When the footman announced, "The Earl and Countess of Clevedon," the music in Lady Rutledge's drawing-room didn't stop, but the conversation certainly did. Genevieve walked into the room at Arthur's pace. She did not drag him, nor did she lag behind. She moved with him, perfectly synchronized. Heads turned. Fans snapped shut. The collective gaze of the ton raked over them, searching for the cracks. They searched for the terrified, stuttering madman and the bitter, impoverished spinster. What they saw was a tall, imposing man in immaculate tailoring, and a woman who looked at the crowd with the bored, slightly murderous indifference of a queen inspecting a mud puddle. They made their way to their hostess, exchanged polite, brief pleasantries, and moved toward the card room. They had survived 10 minutes. Then the crowd parted. Lord Harrington strolled towards them, a glass of claret in his hand, his trademark sneer fixed firmly in place. He looked at Genevieve, his eyes dragging slowly down her blue silk gown, before turning to Arthur. "Clevedon," Harrington drawled. "I must say I am surprised to see you out of your attic, and married, no less. I suppose money truly can buy anything these days, even a willing nursemaid." The surrounding guests fell dead silent. It was a brutal, ugly insult. It bypassed the usual veiled barbs of the tongue and went straight for the throat. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, ready to unleash 8 years of repressed vitriol, ready to tear Harrington to shreds. Arthur's hand tightened on her arm, stopping her. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at the wall. He looked Harrington dead in the eye. "It is a fascinating economic theory, Harrington," Arthur said. The stutter was there, but the panic was gone. His voice carried, deep and resonant. "Though I believe you are confused. Money buys horses, money buys wine, Money buys the silence of the creditors who hold the notes on your failing estates in Cornwall. Harrington's smirk vanished. He stiffened, the glass in his hand tilting dangerously. "What did you say to me?" "I said," Arthur continued, taking a step forward. He leaned heavily on his cane, making himself look broader, an immovable object of tailored wool and cold steel. "You are broke. My solicitor, Mr. Dawes, purchased your banknotes last week, all of them. You owe me £40,000. A collective gasp echoed through the card-room. Genevieve stared at Arthur in shock. He hadn't told her. He had quietly, surgically dismantled the man who had tormented her, using the wealth he supposedly didn't know how to wield. Harrington turned a sickly shade of puce. You are lying." "I am an engineer," Arthur said smoothly, the stutter entirely evaporating under the cold, absolute logic of math. "I do not deal in fiction. I deal in numbers, and your numbers are fatal. If you ever speak to my wife in that tone again, I will call the debts in by Friday. You will be in debtor's prison before the season ends." Arthur didn't wait for a response. He turned away from the sputtering, humiliated lord. "Genevieve," Arthur said, offering his arm again. "I find the air in here incredibly stale. Shall we?" Genevieve looked at Harrington's destroyed face, then at the stunned, silent crowd. She took Arthur's arm, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her face. "Yes, darling," she said clearly. "Let's go home." They walked out. No one whispered, no one laughed. They simply parted, getting out of the way of the Earl of Clevedon and his countess. In the carriage, the adrenaline faded. The damp cold seeped back in. Arthur leaned his head back against the velvet squabs, exhausted. His leg was screaming. Genevieve sat next to him. She didn't speak. She reached over, bypassing the heavy wool of his coat, and found his bare hand resting on his knee. She laced her fingers through his, gripping his hand tightly. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face in the shadowed carriage. "You bought his debt," she whispered. He was an unbalanced equation. Arthur replied softly, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her gloved hand. He needed correcting. Genevieve laughed, a real breathless sound that broke the tension of the carriage. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He stiffened for a fraction of a second before relaxing, wrapping his arm around her. They were not a love story written in poetry. They were a machine built from broken parts. But as the carriage rumbled toward Grosvenor Square, Genevieve realized, with a profound sense of peace, that the machine was running perfectly. Winter hit London like a lead pipe. The damp cold seeped through the thick stone walls of Clevedon House, freezing the water in the wash basins and settling directly into Arthur's ruined leg. For 3 weeks, he barely left the workshop. The bimetallic strip was a nightmare. Fusing brass and steel required heat, precision, and an unyielding physical strength his trembling hands struggled to maintain. Down the hall in the library, Genevieve managed the estate, her ears tuned entirely to the workshop. A low grinding meant progress. Silence meant intense concentration. On a frigid Tuesday evening in January, the silence was shattered by a sharp, concussive crack, followed by a heavy thud. Genevieve did not run. Running was undignified, but she crossed the house faster than she had in years. She threw open the heavy oak door. The room smelled of scorched metal and copper blood. Arthur was on the sawdust-covered floor, leaning heavily against the central workbench, his chest heaving. A vice grip had sheared off the edge of the table. A jagged piece of steel lay near the fireplace, smoking. Arthur was gripping his left hand. Dark blood welled between his fingers, dripping onto his white shirt sleeves. "Arthur!" She dropped to her knees beside him. She reached for his hand, but he yanked it away, his face slick with cold sweat. Do not! He gasped, his jaw locked. It is filthy. The metal snapped. Give me your hand. It wasn't a request. It was a command born of pure, distilled panic that she ruthlessly forced down. He hesitated, looking at her wide eyes. Slowly he uncurled his fingers. A deep gash ran across his palm. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it wasn't fatal. Genevieve let out a sharp breath. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and pressed it firmly against the wound. Arthur hissed, his head falling back against the heavy wooden leg of the workbench. "You are pushing yourself too hard," she said quietly, maintaining the pressure. "You are freezing, and your leg is failing you. The board of L longitude meets in M March," he argued, his voice ragged. "I must have a working prototype. The Admiralty can go to hell. If you lose your hand to gangrene, you cannot build a chronometer." She shifted her position to tie the bandage. As she did, her knee brushed heavily against his right leg. Arthur flinched violently. It was a full-body recoil of pure agony. He bit down on his lip so hard a bead of blood appeared. Genevieve froze. She looked at his heavily scarred thigh, hidden beneath his dark trousers, and then up at his face. The rigid stoicism he usually wore had cracked. He was in blinding pain. "Leave it," he choked out, turning his face away in profound shame. "It is just the cold. It makes the bee-bone ache." Genevieve didn't leave it. She finished tying the blood-soaked handkerchief around his palm. Then she walked to the door and locked it. The heavy iron key clicked with finality. She dragged a heavy wool blanket from the corner, sat back down beside him, and threw it over both of them. "Genevieve, you will ruin your dress. I have 10 others, because of you." She reached under the blanket and found his right leg. He tried to pull away again, panic flaring. "Hush," she commanded softly. She didn't try to examine the twisted injuries. She simply placed both of her hands flat against his thigh, right over the thick wool. Her hands were warm, and she pressed down with a firm, steady weight. No pity, no coddling, just heat and pressure. Arthur stopped breathing. He had assumed his wife, pristine and untouchable, would demand distance from his broken body. But Genevieve's hands were anchored to him. Slowly, the agonizing cramp in his muscles began to ease. The firm pressure provided a counterweight to the deep throb in his bone. They sat on the floor for an hour. The ticking of the clock surrounded them, marking time in a room that felt entirely removed from London. "Why did you buy Harrington's debt?" Genevieve asked quietly into the dim light. "You could have destroyed him in a dozen different ways." Arthur leaned his head against the bench. The stutter was completely gone, smoothed away by the heat of her hands, "because he knew the math of your life," Arthur murmured. "He knew you were carrying the weight of your family's ruin, and he used it to make you feel small. I wanted him to feel the exact mathematics of ruin. I wanted him to know what it felt like to have a ledger dictate his breathing." Genevieve looked at his profile. He wasn't a punchline. He was a weapon, wrapped in velvet and brass, and he had aimed himself squarely at her enemies. She shifted upward, taking his uninjured hand. "Come to bed, Arthur." He grasped his cane, and with her arm tightly around his waist, he pulled himself up. They walked up the grand staircase together. When they reached the landing, Genevieve didn't turn right toward the Countess's suites. She turned left. She opened the door to his massive, draughty bedchamber. She helped him out of his ruined coat and untied his cravat. She did not call for his valet. When she pulled the heavy down quilts over them, the physical distance between them finally collapsed. Arthur lay rigidly on his back, hyper-aware of her warmth beside him. Genevieve turned on her side, draped one arm across his chest, and rested her head on his shoulder. "I am a machine with missing parts, Genevieve," he whispered into the dark, the fear creeping back into his throat. She pressed her mouth to his collarbone. "Then we will build the missing parts together." By May, London was in bloom, and so was Beatrice Hastings. Thanks to Arthur's quiet, ruthless management of the estate and Genevieve's terrifying efficiency, Beatrice's debut was fully funded. She wore a gown of pale green silk that cost more than their old townhouse's yearly rent. Aunt Agatha stood at the edge of the Olmax ballroom, waving a feathered fan with the smug satisfaction of a general who had just conquered a small country. "Look at her," Agatha preened, nodding toward Beatrice, who was currently surrounded by 3 younger sons of viscounts. "Flawless, and to think we were nearly ruined." She cast a sideways glance at Genevieve. "Though I suppose your arrangement proved adequately functional." Genevieve took a slow sip of ratafia. She wore deep crimson velvet, a heavy gold chain resting against her collarbone. "My husband is not an arrangement, Aunt. He is an Earl. You would do well to remember the distinction before you speak to him again." Agatha sniffed, but shut her mouth. The Ton had learned very quickly over the past 6 months that crossing the Countess of Clevedon resulted in swift, brutal social excommunication. Arthur stood a few feet away, engaged in a conversation with Lord Stirling, a senior member of the Board of Longitude. Arthur was leaning on his cane, but his posture was straight. He was speaking quietly, his hands moving to describe a mechanical motion. He wasn't stuttering. When he talked about physics, he never did. Genevieve watched him, a deep, proprietary heat blooming in her chest. They had not spoken of the night in his bedroom, nor the many nights that followed. Their days were still defined by ledgers, blueprints, and the biting pragmatism that had brought them together. But the nights were different. The nights were quiet, urgent, and deeply tender. "Lady Clevedon." Genevieve turned. Standing before her was the Duke of Ashford. He was a man of immense power, terrifying intellect, and legendary cruelty. He was also the man who held the final deciding vote on the Admiralty's chronometer committee. Genevieve dropped into a shallow, perfectly executed curtsy. "Your Grace, I have been watching your sister." Ashford drawled, his pale blue eyes tracking Beatrice. "She is charming, entirely uncorrupted by the practicalities of the world." "She is young, Your Grace," Genevieve said evenly. "Youth affords a certain innocence." Ashford's gaze snapped to her. "Indeed, unlike her sister. Tell me, Lady Clevedon, how is the eccentric Earl? Still playing with his toys? I hear he intends to present a chronometer to the board next week. A bold move for a man who cannot string 3 words together without choking on his own tongue." Genevieve felt the blood freeze in her veins. The air in her lungs turned to glass. She looked Ashford dead in the eye. "My husband does not play with toys, Your Grace. He builds the future. And as for his speech, he merely pauses to ensure his words have value, a habit many members of the aristocracy might benefit from adopting." Ashford's eyes narrowed. The veiled insult was dangerously close to treason in the social hierarchy. Before Ashford could retaliate, a large hand settled warmly on the small of Genevieve's back. "I trust my wife is entertaining you, Your Grace," Arthur said. He stepped up beside her. The stutter was there, the adrenaline of confronting a duke guaranteeing its presence, but his voice did not shake. He looked down at Ashford, using his height and his broad shoulders to cast a literal shadow over the smaller man. "Clevedon," Ashford said, his tone clipped. "We were just discussing your impending presentation. I confess I am highly skeptical of this bimetallic strip you claim to have perfected. Harrison struggled with temperature compensation for decades. Why should we believe a man who isolates himself in a Mayfair attic has solved it?" Genevieve braced herself. She waited for Arthur to freeze. She waited for the panic to lock his jaw. Arthur looked at the Duke. Then he smiled. It was a terrifying smile, cold, sharp, and utterly confident. "Because, Your Grace," Arthur said, his voice smoothing out into a low, resonant baritone. "Harrison relied on gridiron pendulums, which are impractical for a rolling ship. My design utilizes a compensation curb directly acting upon the balance spring. The math is absolute. Brass expands precisely twice as fast as steel. By fusing them, the curb bends inward as temperature rises, shortening the spring and maintaining the oscillation rate. It does not require belief. It requires a basic understanding of thermodynamics." Arthur paused, letting the silence stretch. "If you find the mathematics too taxing, Your Grace, I would be happy to draw you a diagram in chalk." Someone behind them coughed to hide a laugh. Ashford's face tightened with sheer fury. He had been patronized by the village idiot. "We shall see if your machine speaks better than you do, Clevedon." Ashford sneered, turning on his heel and vanishing into the crowd. Genevieve exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Arthur, her eyes wide with shock and adoration. "You just insulted a duke," she whispered. "He insulted my wife first," Arthur replied simply. He shifted his weight, resting on his cane. He looked at the orchestra dais, where the musicians were tuning their instruments. He looked back down at Genevieve. "Do you recall our first dance?" "Vividly. You stepped on my dress. I recall you telling me to look at the wall behind your head." Arthur extended his left hand. The scar across his palm was stark and silver against the white of his glove. "I would very much like to look at your face this tea time." Genevieve stared at his hand. This wasn't an act of defiance against a mocking room. This wasn't a desperate spinster claiming a punchline to save her family. This was a man asking his wife to dance because he wanted her. She placed her hand in his. They walked to the center of the floor. The music started, a slow, sweeping waltz. Arthur pulled her close. He was still not a graceful man. His limp forced a slight, uneven sway to their movements. But he was strong, he was steady, and he guided her with the absolute precision of a man who understood how to navigate resistance. He didn't step on her dress. He didn't apologize. He looked directly into her eyes the entire time. The cynical, exhausted woman he had met 8 months ago was gone. In her place was a fortress of a woman who had stood between him and the cruelty of the world, giving him the space he needed to finally rebuild himself. "You are magnificent," Arthur murmured, his voice lost beneath the swell of the violins. Genevieve felt a tear bite at the corner of her eye, a rare, terrifying slip in her armor. She smiled, her fingers tightening on his shoulder. "We accommodate each other, my lord." The Board of Longitude met in a cavernous, oak-panelled room in Whitehall. It smelled of old paper, sea salt, and severe judgment. 7 admirals and 3 master clockmakers sat behind a long, polished table. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal. On it rested Arthur's chronometer. It was beautiful, a brass and mahogany casing housing the most intricate, perfectly balanced mechanics the world had ever seen. Genevieve sat in the gallery above. Women were strictly forbidden in the board chambers, but she had threatened an undersecretary with a scandal involving his gambling debts, and a chair had magically appeared in the shadows of the balcony. Arthur stood before the board. He had no cane. He stood entirely on his own 2 feet, his hands clasped behind his back. The Duke of Ashford sat at the center of the table, his fingers steepled. "Lord Clevedon, you claim this instrument has lost less than 1 second in a month-long test involving extreme temperature fluctuations?" "Yes, Your Grace." The stutter echoed in the large room. Several admirals shifted uncomfortably. "Explain the escapement." one of the clockmakers demanded gruffly. Arthur looked at the man. Then he glanced up at the dark gallery. He couldn't see Genevieve, but he knew exactly where she was sitting. He could feel her presence, a solid, immovable anchor in a room designed to make him drown. He took a deep breath. "It is a spring detent escapement," Arthur began. The stutter vanished. As he spoke, he dismantled the machine with words. He explained the bimetallic strip, the friction-free pivot, the mathematical formulas that governed the release of tension. He spoke for 20 minutes. He was eloquent, passionate, and entirely brilliant. He wasn't an aristocrat defending a hobby. He was an engineer presenting a masterpiece that would save thousands of sailors from dying on uncharted reefs. When he finished, there was absolute silence. The head clockmaker stood up, walked to the chronometer, and picked up a jeweler's loop. He opened the glass casing and stared at the furiously ticking heart of the machine. He stayed there for 5 long minutes. Finally, the man stood up. He looked at the Duke of Ashford. "It is flawless, Your Grace. He has solved it." The room erupted. Admirals were shouting. Papers were rustling. Ashford looked as though he had swallowed a lemon, but he was outvoted by the sheer, undeniable reality of the math. Arthur didn't celebrate. He simply bowed, packed the heavy mahogany box into its carrying case, and walked out. He found Genevieve waiting in the corridor. Her eyes were bright, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "They accepted it," she said, though she already knew. They did. He didn't wait for the carriage. He took her hand, and they walked out of Whitehall, into the bright June sunlight. The streets of London were chaotic, filled with the roar of carriages and shouting hawkers, but to Arthur, the city had never felt quieter. When they returned to Grosvenor Square, they did not go to the drawing room. They went straight to the workshop. Arthur set the heavy chronometer box on the table. He stood looking at it for a long moment. It was his life's work. It was the thing that had kept him sane in a house full of ghosts. But it was just metal and glass. He turned around. Genevieve was standing near the door, watching him with that same unreadable expression she had worn the day she proposed to him. But the hard edges were gone. "We are done," Arthur said. Genevieve blinked. "Done?" "The contract." He took a step toward her. "Your sister is launched and heavily pursued. Your family's debts are paid. I have my chronometer. The terms of our arrangement have been fulfilled." Genevieve felt the floor drop out from beneath her. A cold, crushing weight settled on her chest. He was ending it. He didn't need her anymore. The machine was running, and the mechanic was being dismissed. "I see," she said, her voice dropping to a flat, deadpan whisper. She raised her chin, fighting the sudden, violent urge to shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Then I shall have my trunks packed. I can return to Aunt Agatha by—" "No." Arthur crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't care about the pain in his leg. He grabbed her shoulders, his large hands gripping her tight enough to bruise. "No," he repeated, his voice harsh, desperate. "You do not understand." He looked down into her terrified eyes. "I do not want a contract," Arthur said, the words tearing out of his throat. "I do not want a business partner. I do not want a woman who manages my ledgers." He let go of her shoulders and moved his hands to her face, cradling her jaw. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. "I want my wife," he said. No stutter. Just pure, absolute truth. "I love you, Genevieve. I loved you the second you knelt on that dirty floor and picked up my broken pieces. You are the only thing in this world that makes perfect sense to me. Please do not leave." Genevieve stared at him. The breath hitched in her throat. 8 years of cynical defense mechanisms, 8 years of believing she was a burden to be sold, crumbled into dust. She reached up, grabbing his wrists. "You fool," she sobbed, a harsh, wet sound that was half a laugh. "You brilliant, oblivious fool! Where would I go? You are my home." She pulled him down and kissed him. It wasn't a polite, hesitant kiss. It was the collision of two people who had spent their entire lives surviving the world, finally realizing they could just live in it. It tasted of salt and copper and a desperate, beautiful relief. Arthur wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the floor. Genevieve buried her hands in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the man everyone had mocked. Society had thought they were a tragedy. Society had thought they were the punchline to a cruel joke. But as Arthur set her down, resting his forehead against hers in the warm, ticking silence of the workshop, Genevieve knew the truth. They weren't a punchline. They were a masterpiece. Did you love Arthur and Genevieve's journey from Mayfair outcasts to an unstoppable power couple? If this story of broken pieces finding their perfect fit captured your heart, do me a massive favor. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video with fellow romance lovers who crave deep, emotionally grounded storytelling, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next historical drama. Tell me in the comments below, what was your favorite moment between the Earl and his Countess? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.